Paris had always been a city that believed in its own permanence. For centuries, its boulevards had carried the steady rhythm of European life, the sound of cafes opening in the morning, newspapers rustling in the hands of commuters, church bells drifting through narrow streets that had survived revolutions, empires, and wars. Even after the first terrible years of the 20th century, Parisians had come to believe that their city possessed a strange kind of resilience. Armies could march across Europe, governments could collapse, but Paris endured. That belief began to fracture in the spring of 1940. The war had already been raging for months. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, France and Britain declared war. But for a long time, the conflict felt distant. The newspapers called it La Drôle de Guerre, the strange war. Soldiers waited along the fortified Maginot Line while civilians in Paris continued their routines with uneasy patience. The cafes remained open. The markets remained full. Life continued beneath a sky that felt increasingly uncertain. Then in May 1940, the illusion collapsed with startling speed. German armored divisions surged across the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands, moving with a ferocity and coordination that stunned European commanders. Tanks and mechanized infantry bypassed France's defensive lines, sweeping through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French high command had believed impassable for a modern army. Within days, the war that had seemed distant was racing toward Paris. Refugees began arriving first. They came in endless streams along the roads leading into the capital. Families pushing carts filled with blankets and cooking pots, children clutching small bundles of belongings, elderly men walking slowly beside bicycles, overloaded with whatever possessions could be carried. Entire villages from northern France and Belgium were on the move, fleeing the advancing German army. The city watched their arrival with growing dread. Every train station filled with people. Newspapers printed contradictory reports. One day the front was holding. The next day, entire divisions had vanished. Radio broadcasts tried to reassure the population, but the tone of official statements became increasingly strained. Then came the bombings. German aircraft began appearing over Paris, dropping explosives that shattered buildings and sent columns of smoke twisting into the sky. Air raid sirens wailed through the streets. Residents crowded into underground shelters and metro tunnels, listening to the distant thunder of explosions echoing across the city. Yet the greatest shock was still to come. By early June, it was clear that the French army was collapsing. German forces had broken through the defensive lines and were advancing rapidly toward the capital. The government, recognizing that Paris could not be defended without catastrophic destruction, made a fateful decision. The city would be declared open. On June 10th, the French government abandoned Paris and fled south toward Bordeaux. Ministries packed their files into trucks. Officials disappeared overnight. The capital of France, one of the most influential cities in Europe, was suddenly without its leadership. In the days that followed, panic spread. Hundreds of thousands of Parisians joined the mass exodus, pouring southward along the highways of France. Cars, bicycles, carts, and even horse-drawn wagons clogged the roads. Those who stayed behind watched the endless columns leaving the city, uncertain whether they were witnessing a temporary evacuation or the beginning of something far darker, because everyone understood what was coming. The German army was approaching Paris. On the morning of June 14, 1940, German troops marched into the city without resistance. Soldiers in gray uniforms advanced along the boulevards, beneath the silent gaze of shuttered windows and abandoned streets. Within hours, the swastika flag was raised over government buildings and monuments that had once symbolized the pride of the French Republic. Paris had fallen. For the millions of civilians who remained inside the city, the war had suddenly changed shape. It was no longer something happening at distant battlefields. It had entered their streets, their homes, their daily lives, and survival under occupation would demand choices no one had imagined making. Because the arrival of the German army was not the end of the crisis. It was only the beginning. Occupation does not arrive all at once. It settles gradually, like a shadow lengthening across familiar streets. At first, the signs were subtle. New uniforms on the sidewalks, foreign voices echoing through train stations, military vehicles rumbling along boulevards. that had once belonged entirely to civilians. But as the summer of 1940 unfolded, Paris began to understand that this was not a temporary military presence. It was a system. The German occupation authorities moved quickly to establish control over the city. Administrative offices were seized. Government buildings were converted into headquarters for the German military command. Hotels that once hosted tourists and diplomats were requisitioned for officers and bureaucrats, who now governed the rhythms of daily life. One of the most visible symbols of the new order appeared on street corners and walls across the city. Posters, printed in stark black lettering, they carried German proclamations in both French and German. These notices announced curfews, regulations, and warnings. Civilians were required to obey the directives of the occupying authorities. Any act of resistance would be punished severely. At night, Paris changed. Curfew bells signaled the moment when civilians were required to leave the streets. Cafes that had once remained lively into the early hours now closed their doors before darkness settled over the city. The boulevards grew quiet. Only the footsteps of patrols and the distant rumble of military vehicles disturbed the silence. Yet the transformation was not only political, it was economic. Germany intended to extract resources from occupied France, and Paris quickly felt the consequences. Food, fuel, and manufactured goods were diverted toward the German war effort. Supply lines that once fed the city were disrupted by the chaos of war. Rationing soon became a central fact of daily survival. Bread, meat, butter, sugar. Each item was strictly controlled. Civilians were issued ration cards that determined how much they could purchase each week. Even with these coupons, store shelves were often nearly empty. Long lines formed outside bakeries before dawn, as residents waited for the chance to buy whatever small portion remained. Hunger began creeping quietly into everyday life. For the poor and elderly, the shortages could be devastating. Families learned to stretch meals with whatever substitutes. They could find thin soups, small portions of vegetables, scraps of bread carefully saved from previous days. The black market grew rapidly as desperate. Residents sought ways to obtain extra food beyond the official rations, but survival required more than finding something to eat. It required navigating a system built on surveillance and control. German authorities relied heavily on cooperation from the French administration that remained in place. Police forces continued operating under French command, yet they now worked within the framework of German occupation policies. This created a complicated and morally fraught environment for civilians. Neighbors began watching neighbors. Casual remarks could be overheard. Political opinions could become dangerous. A careless comment in a cafe might travel farther than intended. People learned to speak cautiously, to lower their voices, to avoid discussions that could attract attention. For many Parisians, the greatest uncertainty was psychological. What did it mean to live under occupation? Should one cooperate in small ways to preserve stability? Should one quietly resist? Or should one simply endure and wait for the war to pass? There were no simple answers. Some individuals chose accommodation, believing that maintaining order and avoiding confrontation would protect the city from greater suffering. Others felt a growing sense of anger and humiliation as German soldiers walked freely through streets that had once symbolized French independence. Beneath the surface of daily life, tension slowly accumulated. And then there were those whose very existence had become precarious. In the early months of occupation, new regulations began targeting Jewish residents of Paris. These measures initially appeared in the form of bureaucratic restrictions, registrations, professional limitations, and property seizures, but they carried a deeper warning about the direction in which the occupation was moving. The city that had once been a refuge for many now felt increasingly uncertain, because survival in occupied Paris would not only depend on ration cards or curfews, it would depend on choices, quiet decisions made behind closed doors, acts of compliance or defiance that could alter the course of a life. And as the war deepened, those choices would grow more dangerous. By 1941, the occupation of Paris had settled into a tense and uneasy routine. The city still woke each morning to the same physical landscape. The Seine moving slowly beneath its bridges, the narrow streets of older districts echoing with footsteps, the great monuments standing as they had for generations. Yet beneath that familiar surface, The structure of daily life had been transformed. Occupation had created a society divided by fear, necessity, and quiet defiance. The shortages deepened first. Ration cards that had once seemed restrictive now felt almost symbolic, because the official quantities rarely matched reality. Meat had become scarce, butter nearly vanished, even bread, the most basic staple of French. Life was increasingly difficult to obtain in reliable amounts. Parisians learned new habits of survival. Meals were smaller. Coffee was replaced with bitter substitutes made from roasted grains or chicory. Families saved every scrap of food. Some raised rabbits secretly in small apartments or courtyards, hoping to produce a few extra meals beyond what the ration system allowed. But food shortages were only part of the pressure. Coal and fuel were also scarce, making winters particularly harsh. In poorly heated apartments, residents layered blankets and coats against the cold. Public transportation slowed as fuel supplies dwindled. Even electricity could be unreliable. The war had begun to reshape the physical experience of living in the city. Yet the most profound changes were political and moral. As German control tightened, the machinery of repression expanded. The occupying authorities worked closely with the French, government based in the southern city of Vichy, which administered the unoccupied portion of France, while collaborating with German demands. Together, they began enforcing policies that reshaped the social fabric of Paris. Jewish residents faced an escalating series of restrictions. Businesses owned by Jews were seized or transferred to non-Jewish managers. Professional careers were stripped away. Families were forced to register their identities with the authorities, marking them as targets within an increasingly hostile system. Then came the visible symbol that could not be hidden. In 1942, Jewish residents in occupied France were ordered to wear a yellow star sewn onto their clothing. The small piece of fabric transformed ordinary movement through the city into an act of exposure. Walking through the streets, boarding a train, standing in a shop line, all became moments where identity was publicly marked and vulnerability was impossible to conceal. Fear spread quietly through neighborhoods because the next stage of occupation was already unfolding. Arrests. Police raids, often carried out by French authorities working under German direction, began targeting Jewish families across Paris. Entire households could be taken from their apartments in the early hours of the morning, given little time to gather belongings before being transported away. One of the most infamous events occurred in July 1942. During what became known as the Velodrome d'Hiver Roundup, thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were arrested in Paris over the course of 2 days. They were held in a large indoor cycling stadium under terrible conditions, crowded, overheated, and deprived of adequate food or sanitation. From there, most were eventually deported to camps in the east. For the rest of the population, these events were impossible to ignore. Even those who wished to remain distant from politics could sense the moral gravity of what was happening around them. Some chose silence, fearing the consequences of intervention. Others attempted small acts of assistance, hiding individuals, forging documents, or helping people escape the city. These actions were dangerous. The German security apparatus, including the Gestapo, actively hunted resistance networks. Arrests, interrogations, and executions were used to suppress dissent. Underground newspapers circulated secretly, carrying messages of defiance and information about the wider war beyond the reach of German propaganda. Gradually, small pockets of organized resistance began forming within the occupied city. Students, workers, former soldiers, and ordinary citizens created clandestine groups that distributed leaflets, gathered intelligence, and sometimes sabotaged German operations. These networks were fragile and constantly threatened by infiltration, but they represented something important: a refusal to accept occupation as permanent. By the middle years of the war, Paris existed in a strange dual reality. On the surface, cafes still served thin coffee, trams still moved along their tracks, and civilians walked through streets watched by German soldiers. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, another story was unfolding, a story of quiet endurance and growing resistance. Because the balance of the war itself was beginning to change, and when it did, the fragile order imposed on Paris would begin to crack. By 1944, the war that had once seemed distant from Paris had begun moving back toward the city. For 4 long years, Occupation had shaped every corner of daily life. German soldiers had become a familiar sight on the boulevards. Ration cards had defined what people could eat. Curfews and regulations had governed the rhythm of each day. Many Parisians had learned to survive by adapting quietly, keeping their heads down, avoiding attention, enduring the uncertainty that came with living under foreign rule. But across Europe, the balance of the war was shifting. German armies were beginning to retreat on multiple fronts. In the east, the Soviet Union had pushed the Wehrmacht back after devastating battles that consumed enormous resources and manpower. In the west, the Allies were preparing a massive invasion that would open a new front against Nazi Germany. On June 6, 1944, that invasion began. Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, roughly 200 kilometers from Paris. The news spread through the city quickly, carried by whispers, clandestine radio broadcasts, and fragments of information passed quietly between friends and neighbors. For many Parisians, it was the first genuine sign that liberation might be possible. But liberation would not arrive immediately. The fighting in Normandy was brutal and slow. German forces resisted fiercely, and the Allied advance took weeks of heavy combat before the front lines began moving inland. During this time, tension inside Paris grew steadily. The German occupation authorities understood that the war was turning against them. Security tightened. Resistance members were hunted more aggressively. Executions and arrests increased as the occupiers attempted to maintain control over a population that was growing more hopeful and more restless. Within the city, the underground resistance networks had matured. What had once been scattered groups distributing leaflets had evolved into a more coordinated movement. These organizations gathered intelligence, sabotaged infrastructure, and prepared for the moment when open revolt might support the advancing Allied armies. That moment came in August 1944. As Allied forces pushed closer to the capital, resistance groups inside Paris began organizing an uprising. Police stations and government buildings were targeted. Barricades were constructed across streets using overturned vehicles. Paving stones and furniture dragged from nearby buildings. The city that had endured 4 years of controlled silence suddenly erupted into confrontation. Armed clashes broke out between resistance fighters and German troops. Snipers appeared in windows. Street battles unfolded in districts that had once been centers of ordinary civilian life. Civilians sheltered inside apartments as gunfire echoed through narrow streets. For several days, the outcome remained uncertain. German commanders still controlled large parts of the city, and they possessed the military strength to cause enormous destruction if they chose to defend Paris aggressively. Adolf Hitler had even issued orders that the city should be destroyed rather than surrendered intact if defeat became inevitable. But events moved quickly. Allied forces approaching from Normandy accelerated their advance toward the capital. French armored units fighting alongside the Allies entered the outskirts of Paris on August 24th. The following day, resistance fighters and advancing soldiers converged in the heart of the city. German forces began surrendering. On August 25th, 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds poured into the streets in scenes of overwhelming relief. Flags appeared from windows and balconies. Church bells rang across the city as civilians embraced soldiers who had arrived after years of occupation. Yet liberation did not erase the memory of what had come before. The occupation had left deep scars. Thousands of residents had been deported. Many had disappeared forever. Families had been divided by war, collaboration, resistance, and loss. The moral choices that individuals had made during those years, whether to resist, comply, remain silent, or help others, would continue shaping memories long after the fighting ended. But Paris itself had survived. The bridges over the Seine still stood. The monuments remained. The streets that had once carried German patrols now filled again with civilians, reclaiming their city. History often remembers wars through the movements of armies and the decisions of leaders. Yet the story of occupied Paris reveals another dimension entirely, because survival was not defined by victory or defeat on distant battlefields. It was defined by the quiet endurance of millions of ordinary lives. People who waited in food lines, whispered forbidden news, hid neighbors in danger, and carried on beneath a sky overshadowed by war. And in the end, that endurance ensured that when liberation finally arrived, there was still a city and a people waiting to greet it.